Achim Steiner, thank you so much for joining me today. The UNDP have just launched a campaign against fossil fuel subsidies. Tell me first about the campaign, why you feel it's so important, and what you hope it's going to achieve.
Well, we have called it Don't Choose Extinction as a name for the campaign because basically for many years we already know that in the way that our economies are subsidizing the consumption of fossil fuels is having two very egregious impacts. First of all, it is distorting markets and is also a very inefficient allocation of taxpayers' money because at the moment the estimate is that every year still $423 billion are expended in terms of subsidizing fossil fuel use. At the same time, it is also preventing the transition towards cleaner energy because only a fraction of that amount is actually used to promote the introduction of renewable energy sources, and therefore our ability to exit faster from a dependence on fossil fuels is severely impaired. It's very expensive to our economies, and what we're trying to do is to help people understand of what you do once you realize that this is a problem. And in fact, the nature of this problem is even bigger than the sum that I just explained it with to you, because the IMF estimates that the total cost of these fossil fuel subsidies in terms of externalities, in terms of health impacts, is more in the range of $5.8 trillion a year. $5.8 trillion a year. So we have every reason to move out of this age of fossil fuel subsidies and to find a better way to actually provide the energy to our economies. Now, UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme's work, really picks up from where these economic and macroeconomic analyses present us with a dilemma and with a problem. Our interest is to now take this conversation to where citizens, industry, parliaments, regulators make decisions to correct for this distortion in our economies and therefore tackle fossil fuel subsidies head on. But it's a complicated thing to do, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a moment.
Achim, it is of course complicated, so how will you simplify the message to get across to people? Tell me about the actual campaign itself.
Well, it will begin first of all with a small film that is really intended to bring this issue to a very wide range of viewers and audiences across the world. It's not a classic United Nations or documentary film. It's a very short film that involves a dinosaur, and therefore the link to the choices we make shouldn't be the same choices that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. There is an element of humor and adventure in there, but really it is to carry a very vital message to a very broad audience.
So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late.
It is meant to interest young people, old people, people who think that they have nothing to do with this, and yet they are part of that fossil fuel economy that is taking us to the brink of a point of no return, also in terms of climate change. And at the same time, what we want is that people, the public, understand why it is that spending $423 billion a year on fossil fuel subsidies is ultimately actually not a rational use of our taxpayers' money. That it is holding us back on the one hand in terms of a transition towards a cleaner energy economy, and secondly, it is also not a very effective use of taxpayers' money. And here comes the complexity. Fossil fuel subsidies are often justified in terms of ensuring that energy is cheaper, whether it's petrol, diesel or electricity, for poorer people. But actually, when you look at the statistics, the interesting reality is that it is something that actually benefits really the wealthier parts of society because they are disproportionately larger users of energy. So if you subsidize a kilowatt hour or a gallon of petrol or a liter of petrol with $423 billion now, obviously divided into the total consumption, you're actually benefiting really disproportionately the wealthier part. So if you're interested in helping poorer people to have access to energy, to fuel, there are much more efficient ways of doing that. and you don't need to distort an entire economy in terms of the way we currently make fossil fuels artificially cheaper to use. And that is where parliaments, governments, regulators, industry, but also we as citizens, as consumers, need to finally take up this challenge and correct something that otherwise will make it impossible for us to move towards a cleaner energy economy.
Well, this is a call to action, Achim, isn't it? To the world, as you're saying, to governments, to citizens. But of course, how do they make that transition? You've talked about the use of taxpayers' money. You've talked about poorer countries being left behind. But there was a recent UN report suggesting that fossil fuel production around the world is more than double what's currently allowed under the Paris Agreement, and is expected to continue to increase in some cases. So in reality, how can this be turned around?
Well, many economists essentially agree that if you were to introduce a carbon price that reflects the true cost of using that fossil fuel in our economies today, you would actually very quickly create a market whereby producers but also consumers of fossil fuels would actually move out of this sector. And we're in fact seeing it already happen with coal. Yes, there are still some economies that are increasing their coal consumption, but actually all over the world, coal and coal-based infrastructure will increasingly become what in financial markets is sometimes referred to as a stranded asset. It has no future. It is not where those who have money to invest and where those who are entrepreneurs and business leaders are willing to place their bets. And in fact, when we look at the global energy economy, we have already begun an energy revolution. In the last couple of years alone, there is more invested in new renewable energy infrastructure and therefore invested in the construction and bringing it on stream than in oil, gas, coal and nuclear combined. So in many ways, we are already beginning to see a very significant shift. Our problem is we are running out of time. We only have maybe a decade left in which we are able to decouple our economies from an increasing fuel consumption that is ultimately driving climate change, carbon emissions, greenhouse gases. That is the urgency, and therefore we need to accelerate these transitions. The direction of travel, a decarbonized energy system, a decarbonized global economy, I think is less and less doubted by anyone. Our great challenge right now is we waited so long that now the window of time is closing literally in a decade or so in terms of that 1.5 degree target that we're aiming at. And therefore, we need to quickly go to the core of what makes our economies either continue using fossil fuels or transitioning towards cleaner energy supplies and production more rapidly. And we believe that fossil fuel subsidies are one of the principal distorting factors alongside other areas in which we can act, but certainly one that permeates our global energy market.
Achim, the United Nations, of course, has called a code red for humanity. You're saying that the world is running out of time. How concerned are you?
Well, just like any other citizen, when I read the reports and look at, for example, the climate scientists with the IPCC report that essentially led the Secretary General to declare a code red for humanity on climate change, when you look just at what has happened to community after community across the globe over the last few months in terms of extreme weather events, these extraordinary forest fires out of control over weeks and months, floods, hurricanes, destruction on a scale that, quite frankly, is frightening. So what is my response? I'm extremely concerned. I'm extremely concerned because I think we are missing an opportunity to act on something that we now know enough about and for which we actually have solutions. But we are stuck in an economy of the 20th century that was built around an extractive model that was looking at economic growth as being fueled by oil, gas and coal. And yet, while it has made us the wealthiest generation in human history, at least in financial terms, as humanity, it's also taken us to the brink. Look at the existential implications of these natural disasters, of these extreme weather events. And this is something that will affect us all. And that is where I think my concern turns into being actually very worried, because I think we still are moving too slow, and therefore that opportunity to act is actually not being seized. And the tragedy of this will be that my children, the next generation, will no longer have the option, because it will have moved beyond that point of no return. Because once we are set on a pathway above 1.5 and then 2 degrees, it will take 100 years or 200 years to be able to reverse that. And that is, in a sense, the historical moment in time in which we find ourselves, when essentially having all the means to tackle climate change, but not finding it within ourselves to take the decisions that are necessary to make this possible.
But it takes time, Achim, for people's habits to change. It takes time for economies to transition. So what will you say to government leaders? What will you say to citizens when you know that they need that time?
Well, we are speaking in the midst of a pandemic. We have just seen the extraordinary display of agility and response that the world, at least parts of the world, were able to stand up to deal with both COVID as a health crisis and as a pandemic, but also in terms of stabilizing our economies. We mobilized in a period of probably less than 12 months over $14 trillion in order to deal with the crisis. Now, thankfully, COVID-19 has, first of all, now a vaccine and gives us the opportunity to look beyond the pandemic. And yet in climate change, there is no cure as such once we have crossed these points of no return, and we are not able to mobilize both the resources and the political will to act on them. And yet I think, this is a journey that we already have been on for over 30 years. First, everybody thought climate change was science fiction. Then the ability to do something about it was somewhere in the realm of the next generation. Then we got the arguments that it's too expensive, we cannot afford to act on it, we will lose our jobs and our economies will collapse because renewable energy is not workable. Well, here we are in the year 2021, some of the most successful economies in the world are economies with the highest proportion of renewable energy in their electricity generating infrastructure. They have created far more jobs than they have lost in this transition, and they're actually doing very well. So we have had to tackle many myths, some deliberately put into the debate in order to slow things down, others partly out of ignorance, and others partly out of we just didn't know where they would work. But this is not where we are today. This is the year 2021, 9 years away from where scientists tell us if we don't manage to achieve the kind of emission reductions by 2030 and then 2050, we have no more option to go back to where we are now. And that is why I believe there is also amongst our youth right now a degree of impatience and growing frustration, and yes, anger also, at the complacency of a generation that is us today, that actually has virtually all the ingredients to make that next step possible, but we're not ready to act, or we're not willing to act on it.
What action do you want to see from COP26?
First of all, COP26 is a vital moment in which the Paris Agreement has to prove that the idea that every 5 years nations would come together and raise their levels of ambition in terms of how they're acting on climate change through these national climate strategies actually is fulfilled. There are still too many countries who have not submitted their national climate strategies, but of those who have submitted them, we are seeing a high degree of raised levels of ambition. It's the only way in which we are going to, over time, bring reality in alignment with where science is telling us we need to be. So, being able to have all countries of the world come together in Glasgow and commit in their own national interest to bring more ambition to emissions reduction, to adaptation financing, to investing in a greener economy, if you want, is going to be critical. And here is one of the great negotiating challenges. The world, particularly the wealthier world, promised already in 2009 and again in 2015 that it would mobilize $100 billion from the wealthier parts of the world to help poorer countries to accelerate their transition, to move into cleaner energy economies. And here we are, well over 11 years later, and that promise still hasn't been fulfilled. We are failing to seize an opportunity to co-invest in each other's ability to make that low-carbon economy become a reality, and to do so in time. And so I think in Copenhagen at the COP, it's going to be critical that we are able to address this commitment of $100 billion of co-investment, because behind those $100 billion from the wealthier world are literally hundreds of billions of dollars that developing countries are going to invest in their future energy infrastructure, their cleaner mobility systems, all of them fundamental to our collective ability to decarbonize, first of all, our economies, and ultimately keep climate change within that 1.5 to 2 degree range.
Achim, how relevant will COP be without the leaders of Russia and China attending?
Let me first of all say, these Conference of the Parties are essentially a fortnight in an otherwise 365-day calendar year in which we don't stop working on all of these issues. They are a particular moment in which the United Nations convenes the world's member states and also heads of government, heads of state and ministers in order to facilitate face-to-face negotiations. Clearly, you have never had a COP where every leader was there, and not every COP in which important achievements were essentially accomplished had heads of state present. So let me first of all say Glasgow as a COP, just like other conferences before it, will proceed. At the same time, obviously, the more we are able to bring key players around the table, the more they're able to look each other in the eye, to be in a room and to be conscious of their collective ability, never mind responsibility, to take important decisions, the better the prospects are. So in some ways, yes, it is always regrettable that some leaders are unable to attend for whatever reasons they may be. But nevertheless, in Glasgow, the world's countries' voices actually will be there. That's what makes the United Nations so unique, that every country, large or small, has a voice and has a seat at the table. And that makes a climate conference such a critical moment, because it is also when we as citizens can observe our countries, our governments, either succeed or fail us in what they're actually able to produce during these negotiations. So let me again remind the world, there was a moment when 4 years ago the United States had elected a new president. That president had announced that they would take the United States out of the Paris Agreement and proceeded to do so. The world didn't stop. In fact, it continued to invest in these clean energy transitions. It continued to meet and to drive the agenda forward. And now the United States has rejoined the Paris Agreement. So there are moments when individual countries may be in a different position, but bottom line is, this is the place where the world meets, and essentially every country is and will be there.
You're saying this is a critical moment in history. What would you say to individuals around the world? What can they do to help drive change?
Begin to affect change where you have the most direct opportunity to engage with others. It might be in your family. It might be the decision about what kind of meals and food consumption you have. It might be just focusing on the fact that in particularly wealthier countries, a third of all the food we buy is wasted. Imagine how much energy, how much emissions, how much land use is involved in producing so much food that ends up in the waste bin. It could be the decision about the kind of car a family will buy, about how you think about generating energy in your home with photovoltaics. It might be what you can do in your school, in your place of work, in your local football club. Don't look at climate change as something that is only actionable in a global climate conference or under the auspices of the United Nations. Much of what we do every day through, for example, the IPCC, the scientific reports, the work that our sister agency, the United Nations Environment Programme or the World Meteorological Organization, is they produce the information, the reports to empower you to take the conversation about climate change to where real life decisions are made every day. What we produce, what we consume, how we run our communities, how we deal with our infrastructure, our local transport systems, our energy systems, our land use choices. Once you begin to realize that there are actually 1,000 entry points in your immediate vicinity where you can make a difference, and you then connect with others and discover that actually there are a lot of other people who would like to do something, you begin to grow movements. And there are so many examples of basically great movements being started by individuals who simply out of conviction felt something needed to be done and then found others. Think of Wangari Maathai, Nobel Prize laureate, a Kenyan woman who began planting trees in Kenya at a time when people laughed at the idea that this would be a way in which to bring communities together and build really a global movement. Look at Greta Thunberg and the millions of other young students around the world right now who have galvanized an extraordinary debate in our societies, and I could go on with many other examples. So my main message is, it's a complex problem, it's a global problem, it requires us to act as a human family of, yes, 7.5 billion people today, but action actually always begins with us as individuals deciding to do something about it. And on climate change, you don't have to be an atmospheric scientist to make a difference on what happens next on this front.
Achim Steiner, Administrator of the UNDP, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.